Okay, let's start. Number 1. The Sator Square. The year is 1936, but the carving is at least 1,900 years old. Archaeologist Matteo della Corte is picking through the ruins of Pompeii's Palestra Grande on November 12th when he finds something scratched into a column. 5 words, a perfect square. The building had been buried since 79 CE, but this particular column had already been damaged once before that. In the earthquake of 62 CE, which means whoever carved these words did it years before Vesuvius ever erupted at all. A fragmentary version of the same carving had already turned up nearby in 1925, meaning at least 2 separate people in the same doomed city thought this square was worth cutting into stone. Nobody in 1936 could explain what either one meant. Nobody fully can today. The words are Sator, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas. Arranged 5 letters wide and 5 letters tall, they form a palindrome unlike almost anything else that survives from the ancient world. Read left to right to left, top to bottom, or bottom to top. The square produces the exact same 25 letters in the exact same order every single time. A sewer, Arepo, holds the wheels. With effort. That's the closest thing to a literal translation scholars have settled on. The sewer Arepo holds the wheels with care. A plain sentence about a farmer, wrapped in a mathematical structure this precise, that took real planning to construct, without a single letter falling out of alignment. And it doesn't stay in Pompeii. The same 5 words, arranged in the same grid, turn up carved into a column at Dura-Europos in Syria, a Roman garrison town on the edge of the empire. Into a wall in Cirencester, England, on the opposite edge of that same empire. Into a house wall in Manchester. Roman-era sites scattered across 3 continents, separated by well over 2,000 miles of ancient travel, all carrying the identical square, letter for letter. Whatever this square meant, it wasn't local superstition confined to one Italian city. It moved with people, soldiers, traders, or believers, across the entire reach of the Roman world, copied with total precision every single time. The mainstream explanation treats it as exactly what it looks like on the surface. A clever wordplay puzzle, a magic square popular enough to spread through Roman culture the way a viral phrase spreads today. Word squares were known entertainment in the ancient world, and this one simply survived better than most, preserved in plaster and stone instead of scrolls that rotted away centuries ago. But rearrange those same 25 letters, and you can reassemble them into a cross-shape spelling PATER NOSTER, Our Father, the opening words of the Lord's Prayer in Latin, with 2 leftover A's and 2 leftover O's left, dangling at the 4 arms of the cross. Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. If that arrangement is intentional, it means someone encoded a specifically Christian message inside a supposedly pagan farming riddle, at a site destroyed in 79 CE, decades before Christianity was legally tolerated anywhere in the Roman Empire, at a time when practicing it openly could get you killed. Other researchers reject the Christian reading entirely. Some argue the square encodes Jewish liturgical wordplay instead, pointing to numeric and letter patterns with roots in older Hebrew traditions. Others tie it to the mystery cult of Mithras, which was active in Pompeii at the exact time this column stood. A handful even question whether arepo is a real word at all. It appears nowhere else in the entire surviving body of Latin literature, which either makes it someone's invented proper name or a deliberately meaningless placeholder, chosen only because it happened to make the grid palindromic. After more than a century of study by classicists, epigraphers, and theologians, there is still no agreement. Was it a farmer's charm? A hidden Christian confession, carved by someone who could be executed for exactly that confession? A pagan magic square later repurposed by early believers into something else entirely? Why does an identical, letter-perfect version of it keep surfacing hundreds of miles apart, in garrisons and provinces that supposedly had no direct connection to each other? The square still reads the same, in every direction, no matter how many times you turn it. That part was never in question. What it was for, and who needed it enough to carve it into a column in a city about to be buried alive under volcanic ash, is a sentence nobody has finished translating. From a word square built to hide something in plain sight, we travel north, to a stone in Sweden that doesn't hide anything at all. It warns you, outright, exactly what happens if you touch it. Number 2. The Bjorketorp Runestone. In a quiet clearing in Blekinge, southern Sweden, a stone stands nearly 14 feet tall. That makes it one of the tallest runestones anywhere in the world, taller than most doorframes, taller than most of the people who have ever stood in front of it and tried to read it. It has stood there since somewhere around the 6th or 7th century, untouched, unmoved, surrounded by 2 smaller standing stones arranged in a triangle around it. No church was ever built nearby. No village grew up around it. Just the stone, alone in the trees, carrying a message that has outlasted every single person who could have explained it in person. The runes are carved in a transitional script, somewhere between the older Elder Futhark alphabet and the younger Futhark that would eventually replace it across Scandinavia. On the shorter face of the stone, the message is brief and blunt. I foresee perdition, or, in some scholarly readings, simply prediction of perdition. No further explanation follows it. Just a forecast of doom, chiseled into rock deliberately built to survive 1,000 years and more. The longer face carries the real warning, and it's worth reading slowly. Translated, it says something close to this. I, master of the runes, conceal here runes of power. Incessantly plagued by malice, doomed to insidious death, is he who breaks this monument. Not a prayer, not a simple dedication to the dead. A direct, targeted threat, aimed at anyone who might disturb the stone in the future, written in a script, chosen specifically to make sure the wrong reader, centuries later, would still understand exactly what they were risking by touching it. This isn't an isolated case, either. 2 other runestones nearby, at Stentoften and Nsibidi, carry closely related curse formulas, using overlapping language, overlapping threats, and strikingly similar phrasing about runes of power and doomed fates. Whoever raised these 3 stones across this stretch of Blekinge was drawing from a shared, deliberate tradition of runic protection magic passed between carvers, not one person's isolated, one-off warning scratched out alone. Here is where the mainstream explanation runs directly into a problem it can't resolve. If the Bjorketorp stone marks a grave, and the curse exists purely to protect whoever is buried beneath it, there should be a grave somewhere close by. In 1914, archaeologists excavated the ground around the stone and the 2 smaller stones surrounding it. They found nothing. No bones, no grave goods, no burial chamber, no trace at all that anyone was ever laid to rest there. So what, exactly, is being protected if nothing physically lies beneath it? Scholars remain split on the answer. Some argue the stone commemorates a person or an event without physically marking a burial site at all, the curse functioning as a standalone monument protection spell, entirely independent of any body in the ground. Others suggest an original grave, if one ever existed, was removed, robbed centuries ago, or simply never fully excavated across an area this size and this overgrown. Neither explanation is proven. Both leave the exact same question standing in that clearing. Why does an empty patch of ground need a death curse this specific, this deliberately worded, and this permanent? The runes themselves remain the only proof of intent that survives. Whoever carved insidious death onto 13 feet of granite chose those words with real care, in a script meant to be read and understood by people, not gods. And in one sense, it worked exactly as intended. No church ever absorbed the site into its grounds. No later farmer plowed the stones under for building material, though countless other standing stones across Scandinavia were repurposed, broken up, or destroyed for exactly that reason over the centuries. This one stayed untouched, standing precisely where it was raised, for well over 1,300 years. Maybe that's the curse doing exactly what it was built to do. Maybe it's simple coincidence and rural isolation, nothing more. But somewhere in Blekinge, a stone still promises insidious death to anyone who moves it. And in 1914, the one serious attempt to find out what it was actually protecting came back completely empty. From a Scandinavian stone that threatens the living directly, we cross the entire globe to the other side of the world, to Australia, where the oldest symbols aren't words at all. They're faces, and every single one of them is missing a mouth. Number 3. Wandjina Rock Art. Duck into a rock shelter in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, out of the heat, and the eyes find you before anything else does. Enormous, dark, staring out from a halo-like headdress that seems to radiate outward in bands, like storm clouds gathering around a skull. Then you notice what's missing. Below those eyes, there is no mouth, not eroded away by wind and water, not damaged by time or vandalism, deliberately, consistently, painted without one, on figure after figure, across shelter after shelter, for as long as anyone outside these communities has been recording them. These are Wandjina, the ancestral spirit beings of the Kimberley's Aboriginal traditions, tied to cloud, rain, and the dreaming itself. To the Worora, Ngarinyin, and Wunambal peoples whose country this is, Wandjina are not folklore, and they are not decoration. They are creation spirits, responsible for the monsoon rains, for the fertility of the land, for the shaping of the Kimberley landscape itself during the dreaming, and they remain central to living law and ceremony today, not something confined to museum cases or the distant past. The missing mouth carries its own explanation, one passed down within these traditions rather than guessed at by outside researchers. In some accounts, the rainbow serpent sealed the Wandjina's mouths shut to stop them from speaking, because if they spoke, the rain and the power inside them would pour out all at once and never stop, flooding the world instead of nourishing it. In other tellings, the Wandjina sealed their own mouths at the very first crack of lightning during the world's creation, and have never opened them again since that instant. Either way, the silence isn't an accident of the artwork. It is the entire point of the artwork. Some of this rock art in the Kimberley dates back thousands of years, layered in places directly over or beside the older Gwayan painting style, an entirely separate artistic tradition that came before it in the same shelters. And here is the detail that separates Wandjina sites from almost every other ancient rock art tradition on Earth. They are not sealed, frozen museum pieces. Aboriginal custodians have continued to ritually repaint and maintain many Wandjina figures well into the 20th century and beyond, refreshing the ochre pigment, restoring the eyes, keeping the images visually alive in a way that essentially no other prehistoric rock art tradition anywhere in the world can claim. This isn't an image frozen at one moment in time. It's a living, ongoing relationship with an image that has never once stopped being actively maintained. Outside, researchers have puzzled over the visual power of the mouthless face for well over a century now. Early European visitors to the region sometimes speculated wildly about outside, non-Aboriginal origin for the imagery, comparing the huge eyes and haloed heads to figures from entirely unrelated cultures on other continents. Theories that Aboriginal custodians and serious contemporary researchers alike have firmly and repeatedly rejected as both factually inaccurate and deeply disrespectful to a continuous, local, living tradition with its own clearly documented meaning, told by the people who have always owned it. What lingers, once you set aside and reject those outside theories entirely, is still the image itself. A spirit powerful enough to make rain fall, powerful enough to shape entire river valleys and coastlines, deliberately rendered without any ability to speak at all, not because the artists lack the skill to paint a mouth. Every other feature on these figures is rendered with total confidence, fine detail, and total consistency across sites and generations. The silence is the craftsmanship. Why does a being with total control over storm and season need its voice permanently sealed shut, generation after generation? Why do custodians keep repainting eyes that stare endlessly, but a mouth that will never, by design, open? The Wandjina have been watching from these rock walls for thousands of years, and by deliberate design, they have never once been able to answer. From a spirit that cannot speak, we travel across the Indian Ocean to West Africa, to a script built by the living specifically, so that most of what it says would never be spoken to outsiders at all. Number 4. Nsibidi script. A length of indigo cloth hangs in a lodge in southeastern Nigeria, dyed deep blue, marked across its surface in stark white symbols arranged in careful, deliberate rows. It's called Ukara cloth, and it isn't decoration. It's a document, written in a script that most of the people who will ever lay eyes on it are not permitted to actually read. The symbols on it belong to Nsibidi, one of the only known indigenous writing systems in West Africa, and for centuries, the people who controlled it made absolutely sure that stayed exactly the case. The oldest confirmed evidence of Nsibidi comes from pottery found in the Calabar region, dated to roughly the 4th century CE. Scholars trace its origin to the Egaham, also called the Ekoi, people of the northern Cross River area, though the script spread outward over the following centuries to the Efik, Ibibio, and Igbo communities living around them. It isn't alphabetic at all. It's ideographic, over 1,000 distinct symbols representing concepts, actions, and objects directly, readable across language lines by anyone properly initiated into the system, regardless of what spoken language they actually used at home. That initiation is the key to understanding the whole system. The Ekpe Society, named for the leopard, took the base Nsibidi symbols and built an entire structure of secrecy on top of them. Ekpe operated for generations, in parts of southeastern Nigeria and western Cameroon, essentially like an actual government, using Nsibidi to record judicial rulings known as Ikpe, to mark territory and property, to communicate warnings, love affairs, alliances, and declarations of war, encoded in symbols carved into wood, painted on walls, worked into cast bronze, tattooed onto skin, and dyed onto cloth like the very ukara hanging in that lodge. Anyone outside the society looking at those same symbols saw only abstract shapes. Understanding them was the entire reason to belong in the first place. European missionaries arriving in the 19th century saw a secret writing system controlled by an indigenous power structure they didn't understand, and moved quickly to dismantle it, branding it pagan and pressuring new converts to abandon it entirely. Colonial administrators worked to break Ekpe's authority right alongside them, viewing it as a rival system of law. But Nsibidi didn't disappear the way they hoped it would. It survived underground, kept alive inside Ekpe lodges and rural communities that never stopped practicing it, passed hand to hand exactly the way it always had been, almost entirely outside of any European written record. There's a deeper, murkier question still unresolved beneath all of this. Centuries before Nsibidi's confirmed 4th century pottery evidence, monolithic carved stones known as the Akwanshi, or Ikom monoliths, were raised across this same cross-river region, covered in abstract carved patterns nobody has ever definitively translated. Some researchers, including field researcher Ivor Miller, describe those older carvings as early Nsibidi signs, a direct ancestor of the later script. Other scholars read the exact same carvings as cicatrization patterns instead, marks representing clan identity and social rank rather than writing at all. No one has conclusively resolved which reading is correct, or whether both could somehow be true of the same stones at once. So the question sits exactly where the society that built Nsibidi always wanted it to sit, on the outside, looking in, unable to be sure. How many specific meanings were carried inside those Ekpe lodges, spoken and understood between initiates, and never once written down anywhere for anyone beyond the initiated to eventually find? A writing system engineered from its very first mark to keep most of what it says a secret has, by design, mostly succeeded at exactly that, for over 1,600 years and counting. From a code built by the living, to be understood only by the chosen few, we go back further than any spoken language at all, to a cave in South Africa holding the oldest drawing a human being is currently known to have ever made. Number 5. The Blombos Cave ochre engraving. In a lab in Cape Town, archaeologist Luca Polarolo is sorting through a tray of stone flakes excavated from Blombos Cave on South Africa's rugged southern coastline. Most of them are unremarkable debris, the ordinary byproduct of ancient toolmaking, the kind of material archaeologists sort through by the thousands without a second glance. Then one flake stops him cold. Drawn across its surface in reddish ochre are 6 roughly parallel lines, crossed by 3 curved lines running the opposite direction. A pattern. Not a natural scratch, not a mineral stain. Someone drew this, on purpose, with a crayon of pigment, pressed and dragged deliberately across the stone's surface. The flake comes from the still bay layers of Blombos Cave, dated to approximately 73,000 years old, Middle Stone Age. Long before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth, long before pottery, long before any settled human community that archaeology can point to at all. Working alongside Polarolo, researchers Christopher Henshelwood, Francesco Derico, and Karen van Niekerk confirmed under microscopic and chemical analysis that the marks were made deliberately with an ochre crayon and published their findings in the journal Nature in 2018. Here is the number that matters most, and it deserves to sit by itself for a moment. This drawing predates every other known abstract or figurative drawing made by a human being, anywhere in the entire world, by at least 30,000 years. Not a small margin of error. 30,000 years is longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization, repeated several times over, standing between this single mark and the very next oldest known drawing that comes after it. For that entire stretch of time, as far as the archaeological record can currently show, nobody else anywhere left behind anything, even remotely like it. There's no real debate about whether this was intentional. The chemical analysis confirms deliberate, careful application of pigment. The pattern itself is not random noise. What there is no possible way to confirm, no matter how advanced the lab equipment gets, is what it actually meant. Was it a tally, counting something now completely lost to time, a territorial marker of some kind? A single surviving fragment of a much larger symbolic system used across an entire community, of which this happens to be the only piece that survived being buried in cave sediment for 73,000 years. A private doodle, meaningless beyond the exact moment someone idly made it? Every proposed explanation is pure speculation. None of them can be tested or proven, because there is only one mark, made by exactly one person, and that person has been gone for 700 centuries. Well, the mark does confirm, more solidly than any single interpretation of its specific meaning, is raw capability. Whoever pressed that ochre crayon into the silkrete flake was already fully capable of abstract, symbolic, intentional mark-making, tens of thousands of years earlier than most models of human cognitive development had ever assumed was possible. That single fact alone forced a quiet but very real reconsideration of how early true symbolic thought actually appears in the human story. And it raises an uncomfortable, entirely unanswerable question of scale. If this one drawing survived purely by chance, preserved by exactly the right conditions in exactly the right cave for exactly long enough for someone to eventually find it, how many others were made across that same span of tens of thousands of years and simply didn't survive at all? How many marks like it, across how many caves on how many continents, quietly rotted, eroded, or crumbled away centuries before anyone was ever there to sort through the flakes and notice? The pattern itself is simple enough to describe in a single sentence, 6 lines crossed by 3 more. What it meant to the person who made it will never be known by anyone who comes after them, no matter how good our instruments eventually get. 73,000 years is not a gap that closes. From a single, unexplainable mark, we travel east, to an entire civilization that left behind thousands of inscriptions on thousands of separate objects, and still, after a full century of trying, cannot get a single sentence of it to speak. Number 6. The Indus Valley Script. In the 1920s, archaeologists brushing dirt from the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in what is now Pakistan and northwest India begin pulling small steatite seals out of the ground by the handful. Carved into each one is an animal, a bull, a rhinoceros, an elephant, or a strange horned creature resembling no living species at all, a figure researchers simply began calling the unicorn for lack of a better name. Above the animal, in nearly every single case, runs a short line of symbols. A full century later, no one on Earth can read a single one of them with any confidence. The Indus Valley civilization that produced these seals was, by any physical measure available to archaeology, staggeringly advanced for its time. Planned cities laid out on precise grids, standardized brick sizes used across a territory spanning hundreds of miles, sophisticated drainage and covered sewage systems that wouldn't be matched again in parts of the world for well over 2,000 years, trade networks reaching all the way to Mesopotamia, and more than 4,000 surviving inscriptions, carved onto seals, clay tablets, pottery shards, tools, and ornaments, found scattered across modern Pakistan and northwestern India. A literate, urbanized, trade-connected society that documented something specific over and over again on thousands of separate objects. The problem is length, or rather, the total lack of it. Most Indus inscriptions are extremely short. On average, fewer than 5 symbols per inscription. The single longest sequence ever discovered runs to only about 26 signs total. Compare that to any other major ancient writing system: Egyptian hieroglyphics, Sumerian cuneiform, early Chinese script, and the gap becomes immediate and glaring. There are no long inscriptions anywhere in the record. No lengthy administrative documents, no extended narratives, nothing resembling a letter, a contract, or a myth written out in full sentences. Just short, repeated bursts of symbols, scattered across thousands of objects, always brief, and almost always paired directly with an animal. That brevity has split scholars for a full century now. One camp argues the Indus script does encode a genuine spoken language, just one we haven't managed to crack yet, likely because we still don't even know what broader language family it belongs to, which cuts off the usual decipherment shortcuts that eventually worked for Egyptian hieroglyphs, or Linear B. Every proposed decipherment, and there have been dozens over the decades, remains unconfirmed and actively disputed by other specialists. The opposing camp argues something more unsettling still, that the short, repetitive, animal-paired symbols aren't language at all, but rather a non-linguistic system of clan marks, ownership tags, or religious symbols. Oppose it has, which would mean there may be no sentence hiding inside them to ever decode in the first place, because none was ever actually written down. Nobody has definitively settled which camp is correct. Statistical and computational analyses of the sign sequences, specifically searching for the structural patterns that real spoken languages tend to produce, have found evidence some researchers read as consistent with genuine syntax, while other researchers read the exact same data as inconclusive, or fully explainable without any underlying language at all. So the seals sit in museum drawers by the thousands today, each one carved by someone who clearly meant something quite specific by it, whether that meaning was a person's given name, a merchant's trademark, a god's formal title, or a full sentence in a language nobody alive has heard spoken aloud in well over 3,000 years. A civilization sophisticated enough to engineer covered city drainage systems left behind no equivalent record of its own actual voice that anyone since has managed to hear. What was worth carving onto 4,000 separate objects, if not something genuinely worth remembering? And if it truly is language, what does an empire this advanced still have left to say? That an entire century of the world's best linguists still can't get it to repeat back. From an entire civilization's silence, we turn to something far smaller in scale and far closer to home. Marks ordinary people carved directly into their own houses, specifically to keep something out. Number 7. Witch marks. A conservator runs a raking torch beam sideways across a centuries-old doorway, low along the stone, the way you'd search for a fingerprint at a crime scene. And there it is, a small flower, 6 petals, drawn in a single unbroken line, scratched directly into the frame beside the door. It's not graffiti, it's not idle decoration, it's a daisy wheel, and someone put it exactly there, next to that specific door, on purpose, because they were genuinely afraid of what might try to come through it. These marks go by the popular name witch marks, though despite that name, they have almost nothing directly to do with witches themselves. They're apotropaic, meaning their entire purpose is protective, to ward evil away from a building and the people sleeping inside it. The daisy wheel, sometimes called a hexafoil, is one of the most common versions found, drawn with a compass in a single continuous line forming 6 overlapping petals. That unbroken line was the entire point of the design. The idea was to trap evil in an endless loop, giving it nowhere clear to enter and no way back out again if it ever tried. Alongside the daisy wheels, you'll frequently find interlocking double V marks, sometimes called Marian marks, invoking direct protection tied to the Virgin Mary. And scorch marks, small, deliberate taper burns, made by holding an open candle flame against wood or stone until it visibly singed, on purpose, in one specific spot chosen with care. All 3 types cluster in the same handful of places, almost without exception, next to doorways, cut into window frames, carved around fireplaces and chimney openings. The vulnerable points. Every gap in a structure through which something unwanted might conceivably slip in. These aren't confined to any single region or country. Witch marks have been documented from Wookey Hole caves in Somerset, all the way to the Tower of London itself, carved by prisoners directly into their own cell walls while awaiting trial or execution. They appear inside Shakespeare's own birthplace, in Stratford-upon-Avon, and they cross the ocean entirely, turning up in colonial-era buildings scattered across North America and in structures documented in Australia, spanning a practice that stretched from the medieval period all the way into the early 19th century, resurfacing whenever fear of witchcraft and the supernatural ran high enough to justify carving protection directly into your own home. Historic England has run public survey projects specifically asking homeowners and building historians to hunt for and formally report these marks, precisely because so many of them remain uncatalogued, undated, and unexplained on a strict case-by-case basis. A single mark next to one particular door might have been carved in direct response to one very specific fear. A recent death in the household, a lingering illness, a rumor of a curse spreading through the village. That original context is almost always lost completely to time. What's left is just the symbol itself, and the plain fact that whoever made it needed it there badly enough to permanently alter their own property over it. The marks worked, in one narrow and unfalsifiable sense. Nothing ever came through those doors and erased the buildings entirely from history. Whether that's because the daisy wheel actually trapped something malicious, or simply because the people who carved it slept a little easier believing that it had, is not a question stone alone can ever answer for us. What the mark preserves, more reliably than any specific superstition behind it, is the exact shape of someone's genuine fear, permanently chiseled into their own front step for anyone since to find. Why does an ordinary home need a compass-drawn trap built directly into its doorway? What did the people who lived there believe was close enough and real enough to be worth permanently carving stone over? From marks meant to keep something out of a home, we cross the Atlantic to Minnesota, where one single stone tried to write an entire nation's history into existence, and most historians who have studied it closely believe it simply lied. Number 8. The Kensington Runestone. In 1898, Swedish immigrant farmer Olof Oman is clearing land in Douglas County, Minnesota, when he finds a slab of greywacke tangled deep in the roots of a tree on his own property. Carved across its face, runes, rows and rows of them, unmistakably Scandinavian in style and letter forms, on a stone sitting in the middle of the American Midwest, nowhere near anywhere runes historically belonged. The inscription tells its own dramatic story, internally dated to the year 1362. It claims to be a record left behind by a party of Scandinavian explorers, describing men lost, killed, and stranded far from home, centuries before Columbus ever sailed, in a location that would place Norse travelers deep in the interior of North America. If genuine, it would single-handedly rewrite the entire accepted timeline of European presence on the continent. It is not considered genuine by mainstream scholarship. Since the first serious scholarly review in 1910, the consensus among linguists and runologists has held firm and grown only stronger with time. The Kensington Runestone is very likely a 19th century creation, not a medieval one at all. Runologist Henrik Williams, among numerous others, has written plainly that the language on the stone doesn't resemble any authentic medieval Scandinavian text he has ever personally examined. The most damning piece of evidence is smaller and more technical than any of that. The stone uses a pentamal number writing system, a specific method of representing numeric values that has no attested documented use anywhere before the year 1885. A genuine 1362 inscription simply could not have used a numbering convention that wasn't invented until 5 centuries after it was supposedly carved into the rock. The circumstances surrounding its discovery only deepen the surrounding suspicion further. The late 19th century was a period of intense Scandinavian pride and homesickness across immigrant America, fueled by renewed interest in Leif Erikson and the broader national romanticism movement sweeping across Scandinavia itself at the time. Immigrant communities, often genuinely marginalized in their adopted country, had every emotional incentive imaginable to want proof that their own ancestors had beaten every other European nation to American shores by centuries. Oman himself owned a small personal library that included material specifically on runic writing, and his close friend, a former pastor named Sven Fogelblad, is believed by some researchers to have possessed the linguistic knowledge needed to help construct a genuinely convincing forgery, possibly intended as a private joke aimed squarely at academics. Both men reportedly held in fairly low regard. Oman never confessed. Not once, for the entire remainder of his life, despite decades of sustained scholarly pressure and public scrutiny directed at him personally. And so, even against a mountain of accumulated linguistic evidence, a small but dedicated community of believers continues to argue passionately for the stone's authenticity, keeping the debate very much alive, well over a century after it was first pulled out of the ground. This is the one entry on this entire list where the honest mystery isn't really ancient at all. The real question isn't what a medieval Norse expedition was supposedly doing in Minnesota. It's why a story this thoroughly dismantled by linguists, historians, and runologists alike refuses to simply die out. Why did an entire community need this specific stone to be real badly enough to defend it across generations? Hard evidence be damned entirely. What does it say about the enduring pull of the past that a demonstrated forgery can outlive the very proof stacked against it by well over 100 years and counting? The stone sits today inside a museum built specifically to house it, in a small town named directly after the discovery itself. Whatever Olaf Oman actually did, or didn't, carve into that grey-wacky slab back in 1898, the underlying need for the story to be true, the desire behind the object, was never really a hoax at all. From a stone that may have lied about the past, we travel south, to Bolivia, to a carving no serious researcher disputes is genuinely real, and no scholar has ever fully explained either. Number 9. The Gateway of the Sunday. At nearly 13,000 feet above sea level, on the windswept Bolivian altiplano near Lake Titicaca, a single arch of stone stands at the corner of an ancient platform called the Calisasaya. It's carved from one unbroken block of andesite, roughly 10 feet tall and 13 feet wide, and every single inch of its upper face is covered in figures that have been staring in the exact same direction for well over 1,000 years now. At the center of the carving stands a figure archaeologists call the staff god, gripping a staff in each hand, its head ringed by 24 straight lines, radiating outward like sunbeams frozen permanently in stone. Marching toward it from both sides, 48 smaller attendant figures, 32 carved with human heads, 16 carved with the heads of birds, arranged in careful, tightly repeating rows, every single one facing the same central point without exception. Nothing about this composition looks remotely accidental. Every figure, every ray, every row was clearly, deliberately planned. The gateway belongs to Tiwanaku, a civilization that built one of the great population centers of the ancient Andes, right on this same high plateau. Archaeologist Wendell Bennett's stratigraphic excavations back in the 1930s tied the gateway's construction to Tiwanaku's classic phase, roughly 500 to 900 CE, based on the ceramic and architectural layers surrounding it directly. That dating has largely held up under later radiocarbon analysis of the wider site, even as more recent Bayesian statistical studies continue refining exactly when Tiwanaku itself first rose and eventually collapsed. What the carving actually means is where all the certainty quickly runs out. Most researchers read the 24 rays and the marching attendant figures as evidence of an astronomical or calendrical function, some kind of system for tracking solar cycles, seasons, or specific ritual dates central to Tiwanaku religious life. But who the central staff god actually represents is still genuinely, actively debated among specialists. Some scholars connect the figure directly to Viracocha, the creator god later absorbed wholesale into Inca religion. Others tie it instead to Thunupa, a weather deity known from older Aymara oral tradition. No accompanying inscription survives to settle the question either way. The gods carved into this gateway don't bother introducing themselves to us. There's a stranger footnote to the gateway's modern history that's worth being completely honest about here. In the early 20th century, an engineer turned amateur archaeologist named Arthur Poznański spent decades studying Tiwanaku, and argued, using calculations based on the extremely slow shift in Earth's axial tilt over millennia, that the entire site was originally built as far back as 15,000 BCE. His theory gained real, serious attention at the time, even drawing genuine interest from professional astronomers who independently checked his underlying math. But the stonework he measured had already been disturbed and partially reconstructed long before he ever conducted his survey. And once direct radiocarbon dating finally became available decades later, his entire timeline was thoroughly and completely discarded by mainstream archaeology. It's worth naming plainly, without hedging. Poznański was wrong, and his 15,000-year claim carries zero scientific support today. It's included here only because it shows how easily even a real, physically documented, undeniably ancient monument can still attract theories that simply don't survive contact with better evidence down the line. What actually does survive contact with the evidence is stranger, in its own way, than any invented age would ever need it to be. A civilization living at nearly 13,000 feet of elevation carved a single, massive stone with a god at its exact center, ringed by 24 precise rays, watched over by 48 silent attendants, and left absolutely no key behind explaining who any of them actually were to the people who carved them. 24 rays, 48 watching faces. What, exactly, was this arch built to count, and whose face, precisely, was it built to face the rising sun for every single morning? From a stone god that has watched the sun rise for well over 1,000 years without blinking, we end our list on an island out in the Pacific, where an entire written language was carved onto wood, and today, not one single living person on Earth can read a full sentence of it. Number 10. Rongorongo. In 1869, Catholic missionaries on Rapa Nui, the island the wider world calls Easter Island, receive a set of wooden tablets from local islanders, each one covered edge to edge in tiny, precisely carved glyphs. Human figures, animals, plants, geometric shapes, arranged in careful rows running boustrophedon, alternating reading direction line by line, the exact way an ox plows a field back and forth. The islanders call the script Rongorongo. Translated loosely, the word means something close to recite or to chant out loud. Nobody who received those tablets back in 1869 could read a single line of it. Nobody today can either, despite everything modern linguistics has thrown at it since. Fewer than 30 wooden objects bearing this script survive anywhere in the world today. Between them, researchers have cataloged roughly 400 distinct glyphs, repeating across some 15,000 individual characters total. That is unmistakably a real writing system, with genuine internal structure and repetition, not random decorative scratching. And for well over 150 years now, it has resisted every single serious attempt made to decipher it. Its age is one of the very few things researchers have managed to pin down recently with any real precision. A 2024 radiocarbon dating study examined the wood of one surviving tablet directly and found that the tree it came from was felled somewhere between 1493 and 1509, more than 2 full centuries before European ships ever reached the island at all in 1722. That single result matters enormously to the whole mystery. It means Rongorongo wasn't some script hastily invented in response to contact with European writing, as earlier generations of researchers had simply assumed. It was already old, already fully in active use, generations before any outsider ever once set foot on Rapa Nui's shores. And still, after more than a century of dedicated effort by professional linguists, only one small fragment of one single surviving tablet has ever been even partially understood. A short section believed to record a lunar calendar. Even that one fragment can't actually be read as full language. Researchers can recognize the underlying pattern of a calendar within the glyph sequence without being able to translate what any single individual glyph actually says on its own. Every other tablet, every other line, every other one of those 15,000 remaining characters stays completely, permanently silent. 10 symbols. 10 continents, or close enough that the difference stops mattering. Europe by way of the Roman world, Scandinavia, Australia, West Africa, Southern Africa, South Asia, the British Isles alongside colonial America, the American Midwest, the Bolivian highlands, and one lone volcanic island out in the middle of the Pacific. A square that reads the same in 4 directions and still hides its meaning. A stone that threatens death over an empty grave. A face that was never given a mouth. A code deliberately built to keep most of what it says a secret. A single scratch older than language itself. A civilization's entire silent voice. A house's own private defense against the dark. A story that may have been an outright lie. A god ringed by rays with no name carved beside it. And now, a script that predates its own discovery by 2 centuries and still refuses to speak. That's the thread running quietly underneath all 10 of these. Not that ancient people were somehow primitive, and not that they were secretly hiding some impossible lost technology either. It's that the basic human need to mark, to warn, to protect, and to encode is far older and more universal than written history itself, and yet the actual content of that marking gets lost, far more often than it ever manages to survive intact. We built the habit of leaving messages behind for each other long before we ever figured out how to guarantee those messages could still be read by whoever came looking next. If you made it through all 10 of these, you already know exactly which one is going to keep you up tonight. Tell us in the comments which symbol got under your skin the most, and let us know where in the world you're watching this from. If you want more real, sourced, genuinely unsettling history like this, subscribe, and we'll keep digging.